What inspired me to write a fantasy fiction novel is that I've always loved fantasy. So one of the first books that I read was the Harry Potter series by J.K. Rowling, and then from that point I just kept reading fantasy. I also started reading the Red Wall series, and I started reading the Percy Jackson series. So I've been exposed to fantasy pretty much my whole life. But what inspired this book specifically was I read this book called The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende, which is a magical realism book. And I got really interested in magical realism as a genre, so I decided to try and write some short stories within that genre. And I wrote down a bunch of ideas. And one of the ideas was of a little girl with healing powers whose powers end up getting used by a pastor. And when I looked at that idea, I thought it looked interesting, but I thought that it needed to be expanded into a longer form. It just required too much for a short story, and that's how I ended up with the novel I have today. I don't think I have a specific writing ritual. One thing I do before I write anything is I plot it out. So I plotted out my book from the beginning to the end before I started. And then when I started the actual writing process, I would plot out the chapter in my head before I started writing it. But there'd be times when I got stuck. So if I got really stuck, then I'd have a glass of wine, and sometimes that would help with the creative process. Sometimes I need to take a couple of days off from writing just to problem solve something, or to get the creative juices flowing again. But I wouldn't say that there was like a specific thing that I did before I started writing. I just kind of sat down and did it. The character that reminds me of qualities I possess would probably be Tato. Because when I was a kid, like I was also like a weird kid, very much in my own head and in my own world, and like my parents actually also thought that I had like gifts, and I could see like dead people, and I can't remember if I actually could, but I think that her sense of like curiosity and her sort of desire to help people in the way that she does is pretty similar to how I was as well as a child. So I think that out of all the characters, it's definitely her. I think that all of the characters surprised me in different ways. But I think the one that surprised me the most was Solomon. When I started out the book, I kind of just broadly wrote down who the characters were, what their motivation would be, and just gave very broad strokes the type of people they would be. But I only got the details when I was writing, so I kind of saw in my Solomon as being a certain kind of person in my mind. But as I was writing him, that's how I really got into his thinking process, and I started adding things like maybe he would be traumatized by his father's drinking to the point where he wouldn't touch alcohol at all, and that became a big part of his character. So Solomon took a lot of twists and turns. So did Kheti, because when I finished the first drafts of the book, I realized that Kheti is a raging bitch, and I needed to make her a bit more sympathetic. So I started trying to add more of a conscience to her and make her feel more a sense of guilt over some of the worst things she did. And she ended up becoming someone who was a lot more grey by the end of the novel than she was when I started her out. What was actually funny about the writing process is that I wrote most of my first draft. Well, actually, I wrote the entirety of my first draft in 2019. And then when I sat down again to work on the second draft in 2020, I realized that I had that it was a big mess. There were entire chapters that I'd left out. There were entire characters that needed reworking. So I spent 2020 doing that. And lockdown gave it a bit of an interesting dimension. On the one hand, I had more time to write because I wasn't going out and I wasn't traveling to and from work. So I would have expected it to make the process easier, but I think just kind of living in the uncertainty of a pandemic made it a bit harder. So I struggled a lot to write my second draft. And I think one of the things I kind of taught myself was self-motivation. So there'd be times when I really, really didn't want to write, and I kind of have like a whole internal argument with myself where I'd be like, you have to go and write, and then I would sit down and I would write a paragraph. I think I kind of learned that this whole expectation I set for myself that I'd write about 1,000 words a day, which is not realistic. So even if I just wrote a sentence, that was progress, and that's how I ended up finishing the book. The book is a fantasy, so if you're into fantasy, if you're into like exploring fantastical content, like type stories within a South African content, then you can expect a lot of that, especially in Tato's point of view chapters. I also do go into, like the role that, well, not the role of religion, but the way that people use religion to, and they twist it for their own means in order to gain power or money. That's a major theme in my book. So if you're interested in that kind of content, it's there as well. And it also does touch quite heavily on intergenerational trauma, particularly trauma that like families experienced back in like apartheid, and how they continue, that trauma continues to affect them to this day. So that's what you can expect from the book.